In the gleaming halls of Buckingham Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of royal tradition, a single moment of human vulnerability would shatter the carefully constructed walls of protocol forever. What started as a routine morning would become the day that revealed the most closely guarded secret in the British royal family, a secret so shocking that even the Queen's most trusted guards questioned everything they thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and the price of wearing a crown. Sometimes the most powerful people in the world are also the most fragile. Sometimes those sworn to protect discover they must choose between following orders and following their conscience. And, sometimes, a moment of uncontrollable shaking can unveil a truth that threatens to bring down the monarchy itself. This is that story. The rain hammered against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace with unusual force that Tuesday morning in November. Sergeant James Morrison had been standing guard outside the blue drawing room for exactly 43 minutes when he first noticed something was wrong. His military training had taught him to observe everything, to catch the smallest details that others might miss. After 12 years protecting the royal family, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was out of place. Princess Anne was scheduled to meet with the charity representatives at 9 o'clock sharp. She was known throughout the palace for her punctuality, arriving exactly 3 minutes before any appointment, reviewing her notes one final time before entering. It was now 8:57, and she was nowhere to be seen. Morrison shifted slightly, his polished boots making no sound on the Persian carpet that had witnessed countless royal conversations over the decades. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs whose painted eyes seemed to watch his every movement. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of staff preparing for the day's activities and the relentless drumming of rain against glass. At exactly 8:58, Morrison heard footsteps approaching from the east wing. The familiar click of low heels on marble told him it was Princess Anne even before she came into view. But something was different. The rhythm was off, irregular, as if she was struggling to maintain her usual confident stride. When she finally appeared around the corner, Morrison immediately understood why his instincts had been screaming warnings at him. Princess Anne, the woman known throughout Britain for her unwavering composure and steel nerves, was visibly shaking. Her hands trembled as she clutched a manila folder against her chest, and her usually perfect posture had given way to something that looked almost like she was trying to make herself smaller, less visible. The princess wore her customary navy blue suit, perfectly tailored and immaculately pressed, but Morrison could see that her normally steady breathing was shallow and rapid. Her face, usually bearing the calm expression that had carried her through decades of public appearances, showed traces of something Morrison had never seen before: genuine fear. She stopped about 10 feet from the door to the blue drawing room, and Morrison watched as she closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Her hands continued to shake, and she pressed the folder even tighter against her chest as if it might somehow steady her. For a moment, Morrison thought she might turn around and leave entirely. Morrison had protected many members of the royal family over his career. He had seen them in moments of triumph and tragedy, had watched them navigate political crises and personal scandals. He had been present during some of their most private conversations, had witnessed arguments and reconciliations that would never make it to the newspapers. But he had never seen any of them look genuinely terrified. The princess opened her eyes and seemed to notice Morrison for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, and, in that moment, Morrison saw something that made his blood run cold. It was not just fear he saw in her expression, but the kind of desperate plea that comes from someone who has nowhere else to turn. She looked at him as if she was hoping he might somehow understand what she could not say aloud. Morrison had been trained never to acknowledge what he saw or heard while on duty unless directly addressed. Royal guards were expected to be invisible, to serve as living furniture that provided security while maintaining the illusion that private conversations were truly private. Speaking first to a member of the royal family without being spoken to was grounds for immediate dismissal. But something in Princess Anne's expression made Morrison forget every rule he had ever learned about royal protocol. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you quite well?" The princess looked startled, as if she had forgotten that he was a real person rather than just another piece of palace decoration. For several long seconds, she stared at him without speaking, and Morrison began to wonder if he had just destroyed his career with 6 simple words. Then, to his complete amazement, princess and stepped closer to him. She glanced quickly in both directions to ensure they were alone in the corridor before speaking in a voice so low that Morrison had to strain to hear her. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time in all the years he had protected her. "How long have you been assigned to my detail?" 12 years, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, confused by the question but determined to answer honestly. "In those 12 years, have you ever known me to cancel an official engagement without notice?" Morrison thought quickly. He could remember dozens of events, hundreds of appointments, countless official functions. Princess Anne was famous for her reliability, for showing up regardless of weather, illness, or personal circumstances. The British press had often commented on her dedication to duty, her refusal to let anything interfere with her responsibilities. "No, Your Royal Highness. Never." Princess Anne nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already known. She looked down at the folder in her hands, and Morrison could see that whatever was inside it was causing her hands to shake even more violently. "The representatives from the Children's Hope Foundation are waiting for me in there," she said, nodding toward the blue drawing room. "They have been planning this meeting for months. They need our support for their new initiative to help children who have been." She paused, struggling to find the words. "Children who have been hurt by people they trusted." Morrison said nothing, but he could see that discussing the topic was causing the princess even more distress. Her breathing became even more shallow, and she seemed to be fighting to maintain control of herself. "I received this folder this morning," she continued, lifting the manila envelope slightly. "It contains information. Information about someone very close to our family. Someone who has been helping with charity work involving children for many years." The implication hit Morrison like a physical blow. He had been around the royal family long enough to understand the unspoken rules, the careful language they used when discussing sensitive matters. When Princess Anne spoke of someone very close to their family who worked with children's charities, she could only be referring to a handful of people. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said carefully, "perhaps you should speak with whom?" Princess Anne interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "With my mother? With my brothers? With the private secretaries who have spent decades protecting our family's reputation above everything else?" Morrison could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she was fighting desperately to keep them from falling. In all his years of service, he had never seen any member of the royal family cry in front of him. "The children in those files," Princess Anne whispered, "they trusted the wrong person. And that wrong person has been welcomed into palaces, has been photographed with our family, has been given access to hundreds of other children because we vouched for him." Morrison felt his own hands beginning to clench into fists. If what Princess Anne was suggesting was true, then the implications went far beyond a simple scandal. This was not about embarrassing newspaper headlines or difficult questions from Parliament. This was about children who had been harmed while under the supposed protection of people they trusted. "What can I do to help, Your Royal Highness?" Morrison asked, abandoning all pretense of formal protocol. Princess Anne looked at him with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with despair. "I do not know if anyone can help," she said. "If this information becomes public, it will not just damage our family. It will destroy the trust that people have in the institutions we represent. It will make people question whether we can protect anyone if we could not protect children." Morrison thought of his own daughter, safe at home with his wife, preparing for another ordinary day at school. He thought of all the parents across the country who trusted their children to schools, churches, youth organizations, and charitable foundations partly because those institutions had royal patronage. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said slowly, with respect, "the trust people have in institutions should depend on those institutions doing the right thing, even when it is difficult." Princess Anne stared at him for a long moment, and Morrison wondered if he had overstepped the boundaries of what a guard should say to royalty. But then, she nodded slowly. "You are right, of course," she said. "But knowing what is right and having the courage to do it are not always the same thing." The sound of approaching footsteps made both of them freeze. Princess Anne quickly stepped back to a more appropriate distance, and Morrison resumed his formal stance as a young palisade appeared around the corner. "Your Royal Highness," the aide said with a bow, the representatives from the Children's Hope Foundation are ready for your meeting." Princess Anne looked at Morrison one more time, and he could see her making a decision in real time. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin in the manner that had been drilled into her since childhood, and walked toward the door to the blue drawing room. But Morrison noticed that she was still shaking, and she still clutched the manila folder as if it contained the most dangerous secrets in the world. As she disappeared into the meeting room, Morrison remained at his post, but his mind was racing. He thought about his oath of service, his duty to protect the royal family from all threats. But what happened when the threat came from within the family itself? What happened when protecting them might mean allowing harm to continue? Morrison had never faced a moral dilemma of this magnitude during his military career or his years of royal service. He had always been able to clearly identify who he was protecting and who he was protecting them from. But now, for the first time in his life, he was not certain that protecting the royal family was the same thing as doing what was right. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, and Morrison settled in for what he sensed would be the longest and most important day of his career. Whatever was in that manila folder, whatever Princess Anne had learned about someone close to their family, he had a feeling that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Inside the blue drawing room, he could hear the muffled sounds of conversation beginning. Princess Anne's voice, though strained, carried the same tone of gracious professionalism that had served her throughout decades of public service. But Morrison knew that beneath that carefully controlled exterior, she was still shaking. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen arrived at the small cafe in Mayfair exactly 10 minutes before the agreed time. Morrison had chosen the location carefully, quiet enough for a private conversation, but public enough that their meeting would not attract attention. He had arrived 20 minutes early, positioning himself at a corner table where he could watch both entrances while remaining partially hidden from view. Princess Anne had not slept the previous night. Morrison could tell from the dark circles under her eyes and the way she held herself, as if every movement required enormous effort. She had changed from her usual formal attire into a simple black coat and jeans, with a scarf wrapped around her face in an attempt to avoid recognition. Even so, Morrison worried that her distinctive posture would give her away to anyone who looked too carefully. Detective Inspector Chen was a small, precise woman in her 40s with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Morrison had researched her background the previous evening and learned that she had spent 15 years specializing in cases involving crimes against children. Her reputation for thoroughness and sensitivity was legendary within the Metropolitan Police. "Mr. Morrison," Detective Inspector Chen said quietly as she approached their table. "And I assume this is the anonymous individual who provided the information." Princess Anne lowered her scarf and looked directly at the detective. Chen's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure admirably. "Your Royal Highness," Chen said with a slight nod. "I must say, this is not what I was expecting when Mr. Morrison called yesterday." "Detective Inspector," Princess Anne replied, "what you were expecting is far less important than what we need to discuss. Please, sit down." Chen took the seat across from them and immediately pulled out a small recording device. "With your permission, I would like to record this conversation. Given the nature of the allegations and the people involved, it is essential that we have an accurate record of everything that is said." Princess Anne hesitated for a moment. Morrison knew that agreeing to be recorded was an enormous step for someone in her position. Once her words were on record, there would be no way to deny or minimize what she was about to reveal. "Very well," Princess Anne said finally. "But I must emphasize that this conversation is being held in the strictest confidence. If any details are leaked before we have had a chance to address this matter properly, it could compromise both the investigation and the safety of the children involved." Detective Inspector Chen nodded and started the recording. "Today is Thursday, November 15, 2024. I am Detective Inspector Sarah Chen of the Metropolitan Police Special Victims Unit. I am speaking with Her Royal Highness Princess Anne and Mr. James Morrison regarding allegations of serious crimes against children." "Your Royal Highness, can you please explain how you became aware of these allegations?" Princess Anne placed the manila folder on the table between them. 3 weeks ago, I received information from a young woman who claimed to have evidence of systematic abuse of children by someone closely associated with our family. Initially, I was skeptical. We receive many claims against public figures, most of which prove to be unfounded.
What changed your mind? Chen asked.
The details, Princess Anne replied quietly. The consistency of the accounts, the specific nature of the allegations, and the fact that this young woman was asking for nothing except that the truth be revealed. She was not seeking money, publicity, or revenge. She simply wanted the abuse to stop.
Detective Inspector Chen opened her notebook. Can you provide me with contact information for this woman? Her name is Emma Richardson, Princess Anne said.
She is now 26 years old, but the events she describes took place when she was 13. She provided contact details for 11 other victims, all of whom have given permission for their stories to be shared with law enforcement. Morrison watched as Princess Anne opened the manila folder and began removing documents. Even in the dim lighting of the cafe, he could see Chen's expression change as she looked at the photographs and written testimonies. "My God," Chen whispered, then caught herself and resumed her professional demeanor.
Your Royal Highness, these are very serious allegations. Can you tell me the name of the accused? Princess Anne took a deep breath.
Morrison could see her hands beginning to shake again, and he instinctively moved closer to offer support.
Lord Edmund Pemberton, Princess Anne said clearly.
He has been a family friend and charity patron for over 20 years. He has had regular access to children through various youth organizations that we support, and he has attended numerous private functions at royal residences.
Detective Inspector Chen wrote the name carefully in her notebook. Your Royal Highness, I need to ask this directly. Did you or any member of your family ever witness anything that might have suggested inappropriate behavior toward children? The question hung in the air for several long seconds.
Morrison could see the agony in Princess Anne's face as she considered her answer. "No," she said finally.
At least, nothing that I recognized as inappropriate at the time. Lord Pemberton was always very good with children.
They seemed to enjoy his company, and he was generous with his time and attention. Parents were honored when he showed interest in their children.
That is often how predators operate, Chen said gently.
They are skilled at appearing trustworthy and gaining the confidence of both children and adults.
Can you describe the nature of Lord Pemberton's access to children? Princess Anne pulled out a document from the folder. I had my secretary compile a list yesterday evening. Over the past 8 years, Lord Pemberton has attended 43 events involving children.
These include charity functions, youth awards ceremonies, school visits, and private gatherings at royal residences. He has also been involved in organizing summer camps and educational trips for disadvantaged children. Morrison felt sick as he listened to the scope of Lord Pemberton's access. 43 events over 8 years meant hundreds of children who had been in his presence, many of whom had been specifically introduced to him because of his royal connections.
Detective Inspector, Morrison interjected, what happens now? How quickly can you begin an investigation? Chen looked up from her notes.
Given the seriousness of these allegations and the number of potential victims involved, this will become a high-priority investigation immediately. However, I must warn both of you that once we begin formal proceedings, it will be very difficult to control how the information becomes public.
What do you mean? Princess Anne asked.
I mean that Lord Pemberton will need to be arrested and questioned. When that happens, particularly given his high profile and connections to your family, the media will become involved very quickly. There will be intense scrutiny of everyone who has been associated with him, including members of the royal family.
Princess Anne nodded slowly. Detective Inspector, I want you to understand something clearly.
The reputation of my family, while important to me personally, is secondary to ensuring that no more children are harmed. If Lord Pemberton is guilty of these crimes, he must be stopped immediately, regardless of the consequences for anyone else. Morrison felt a surge of pride at Princess Anne's words. In that moment, he knew that she had chosen to prioritize the safety of children over everything else that had defined her life.
There is something else we need to discuss, Detective Inspector Chen said carefully.
The investigation will need to include a review of all the events Lord Pemberton attended, all the organizations he was involved with, and all the people who facilitated his access to children.
This may include interviewing members of your family and palace staff. Including me, Morrison said.
Yes,
Chen confirmed. Mr.
Morrison, you were present at many of these events in a security capacity. You may have observed interactions that seemed innocent at the time but could be relevant to the investigation. Morrison thought back over the years of events he had worked where Lord Pemberton had been present. He remembered seeing him talking with children, remembered parents approaching him for photographs, remembered thinking how good he was with young people. The possibility that he had unknowingly witnessed predatory behavior made Morrison feel complicit in a way that was almost unbearable.
Detective Inspector, Princesson said, I need to ask about the timeline. How long before Lord Pemberton is arrested?
If I can verify the contact information for the victims and confirm that they are willing to cooperate with the investigation, we could move as early as tomorrow morning, Chen replied.
Why do you ask?
Because Lord Pemberton is scheduled to attend a youth charity event this Saturday afternoon.
There will be over 100 children present, many of them from vulnerable backgrounds. If there is any possibility that he poses a continuing threat, that event must be cancelled. Detective Inspector Chen made another note.
I will contact the event organizers immediately after this meeting. The event will be postponed indefinitely. Morrison realized that canceling such a high-profile event would likely generate media attention and questions. Once reporters started investigating why the event had been cancelled, it would not take them long to connect Lord Pemberton's absence to larger issues. Your Royal Highness, Chen continued, there is one more thing I need to discuss with you. Given your family's long association with Lord Pemberton, and given the public trust that has been placed in institutions you represent, there may be calls for a broader investigation into how this situation was allowed to develop.
What kind of broader investigation? Princesson asked.
An investigation into whether there were systemic failures that enabled Lord Pemberton to continue accessing children despite warning signs. An investigation into whether proper safeguarding procedures were in place at royal events and charity functions. Possibly even an investigation into whether anyone in positions of authority failed to act on information that should have raised red flags. Morrison could see Princesson processing the implications of what Detective Inspector Chen was describing. This was no longer just about prosecuting one individual for crimes against children. This was about potentially exposing decades of institutional failures that had created an environment where those crimes could occur. Detective Inspector, Princesson said quietly, if such investigations reveal that our institutions failed to protect children, then those institutions need to be held accountable and reformed. The trust that people have placed in us carries with it the responsibility to deserve that trust. Chen closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. Your Royal Highness, in 15 years of investigating crimes against children, I have rarely seen someone in your position demonstrate this level of moral clarity about such a difficult situation. Most people in positions of power try to minimize their exposure and limit the scope of investigations. Most people in positions of power do not have to look at photographs of 12 children who were harmed while under their supposed protection, Princesson replied. As their meeting concluded, Detective Inspector Chen gathered copies of all the documents in Princesson's folder and promised to begin the investigation immediately. She emphasized again that once formal proceedings began, the situation would develop very quickly and largely outside their control. Walking back to the palace through the London streets, Morrison and Princesson barely spoke. Both understood that they had just set in motion events that would change not only their own lives, but possibly the future of the British monarchy itself. The weight of truth, Morrison realized, was sometimes almost unbearable. But it was still lighter than the weight of lies. Lord Edmund Pemberton was arrested at his estate in Gloucestershire at 6:30 on Friday morning. Detective Inspector Chen had moved quickly, coordinating with local police to ensure that he could not destroy evidence or flee the country. By 7 o'clock, news vans were already gathering outside his property, and, by 8 o'clock, the story was breaking on every major news network in Britain. Morrison first learned about the arrest when his personal phone rang at 7:15. He was having breakfast with his wife and daughter before beginning another day of palace duty, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while knowing that everything was about to change. James, Princesson's voice was tight with stress when he answered. Are you watching the news? Not yet, Your Royal Highness.
Has something happened? Turn on BBC One. Now.
Morrison reached for the television remote while his wife looked at him with concern. Their 8-year-old daughter was eating cereal and chatting about a school project, blissfully unaware that her father's world was about to be turned upside down. The BBC newsreader's voice filled their kitchen. Lord Edmund Pemberton, a prominent charity patron with close ties to the royal family, has been arrested on suspicion of multiple counts of child sexual abuse. The Metropolitan Police conducted early morning raids at his Gloucestershire estate and his London residence. Lord Pemberton has been a regular attendee at royal events for over 20 years and has been photographed numerous times with members of the royal family. Morrison's wife dropped her coffee mug, sending hot liquid splashing across the kitchen floor. Their daughter looked up from her cereal with wide eyes.
Daddy, is that the man who was at Grandma's birthday party? The one who played games with all the children?
Morrison felt his blood turn to ice. His mother-in-law had celebrated her 70th birthday 6 months earlier with a garden party that had included several family friends and their children. Lord Pemberton had been there, and Morrison remembered him spending considerable time entertaining the children with magic tricks and games.
Morrison's own daughter had been among those children.
"James," his wife whispered, "please tell me our daughter was never alone with that man."
Morrison tried to remember every detail of that afternoon.
He had been off duty, relaxed, focused on family rather than security concerns. He remembered Lord Pemberton offering to show some of the children his vintage car collection in the garage. Several children had gone with him, including their daughter. "I need to go," Morrison told Princess Anne, who was still on the phone.
"James, wait. The palace is about to become a siege. Every reporter in London will be here within the hour. I need you to know that this is going to get much worse before it gets better."
Morrison was already moving toward his daughter, kneeling beside her chair.
"Sweetheart, I need to ask you something very important. Do you remember the man at Grandma's party who showed you his cars?" His daughter nodded. "He was nice. He let us sit in the driver's seats and pretend to drive. Did he ever touch you in a way that made you uncomfortable? Or ask you to keep secrets about anything?"
Morrison's wife moved closer, her face pale with understanding and fear.
Their daughter looked confused by the question. "No, Daddy.
He just showed us the cars and told us stories about driving them."
"Why are you asking scary questions?"
Morrison felt relief wash over him, but he knew that his daughter's safety did not diminish the horror of what other children had experienced. "Everything is fine, sweetheart," Morrison said, hugging her tightly.
"Daddy just needed to make sure you were safe."
By the time Morrison arrived at Buckingham Palace 2 hours later, the scene was exactly as Princess Anne had predicted. Dozens of reporters and camera crews crowded against the palace gates, shouting questions at anyone who entered or left.
News helicopters circled overhead, and police barriers had been erected to control the growing crowds of curious onlookers.
Morrison had to show his identification 3 times before he was allowed through the gates, and even then, reporters recognized his uniform and began shouting questions about his role in royal security and whether he had ever witnessed inappropriate behavior at palace events. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in his 12 years of service. Staff members moved through the corridors in hushed tones, and the usual calm efficiency had been replaced by barely controlled panic. Morrison found Princess Anne in her private office, surrounded by papers and speaking rapidly into her telephone.
"I do not care what the precedent is," she was saying.
"I do not care about protocol or procedure or protecting institutional reputation. Children have been harmed, and our response must reflect the seriousness of that fact, not our concern about negative publicity." When she saw Morrison, Princess Anne ended her call abruptly. "The Palace Communications Office wants to release a statement distancing our family from Lord Pemberton," she said without preamble. "They want to emphasize that he was never an official employee or representative of the royal family, that his charitable work was independent, and that we had no knowledge of any inappropriate behavior." "That sounds reasonable," Morrison said carefully. "It is a lie," Princess Anne replied flatly. "Lord Pemberton was not an official employee, but he was far more than a casual acquaintance. He attended private family gatherings.
He was given access to royal residences. We actively supported his charity work and encouraged others to trust him based on that support. Morrison could see the moral struggle playing out in Princess Anne's expression. The palace communication strategy was designed to minimize royal involvement and legal liability, but it also minimized royal responsibility for the systems that had allowed harm to occur. Your Royal Highness, what do you want to do instead? I want to tell the truth, Princess Anne said. I want to acknowledge that Lord Pemberton had significant access to children through events and organizations we supported. I want to commit to a comprehensive review of all our safeguarding procedures. And I want to publicly apologize to every child who was harmed while under the supposed protection of institutions we represent. Morrison's phone began ringing. He glanced at the screen and saw Detective Inspector Chen's number. Detective Inspector, Morrison answered, putting the call on speaker so Princess Anne could hear. Mr. Morrison, I am calling to update you on the investigation. Lord Pemberton has been charged with 14 counts of child sexual abuse involving 12 victims. We expect additional charges as more victims come forward. Morrison felt sick. Even in his worst fears, he had not imagined the scope would be this extensive. Detective Inspector, Princess Anne said, how many additional victims are you anticipating? Based on our preliminary interviews and the timeline of Lord Pemberton's activities, we believe there could be as many as 30 victims over a 15-year period. Your Royal Highness, I need to inform you that the investigation will necessarily include a detailed review of every event Lord Pemberton attended where children were present. How many events are we discussing? Morrison asked. Our initial count is 67 events over 15 years, including 23 events at royal residences or with official royal patronage. We will need to interview staff members who worked those events, review guest lists and photographs, and attempt to contact families whose children attended. Princess Anne closed her eyes. Morrison realized she was calculating not just the scope of the investigation, but the scope of potential harm to children that could have been prevented if proper safeguards had been in place. Detective Inspector, Princess Anne said, you will have the complete cooperation of everyone in this household. Every document you need, every interview you require, every piece of information that might help identify additional victims or prevent future harm. Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your cooperation, but I must warn you that this level of transparency may expose the royal family to significant legal and public relations consequences. Detective Inspector, Princess Anne replied, I would rather face legal consequences for failing to protect children than avoid consequences by continuing to fail to protect them. After ending the call with Detective Inspector Chen, Princess Anne and Morrison sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, they could hear the growing noise of protesters and reporters gathered at the palace gates. James, Princess Anne said finally, I need to ask something of you that goes beyond duty or loyalty to the crown. What do you need, Your Royal Highness? I need you to help me do something that may cost both of us our positions, but which is the right thing to do. Morrison thought about his daughter, safe at school but living in a world where trusted adults sometimes betrayed that trust in the most horrific ways. He thought about the 12 children whose testimonies had started this investigation, and the dozens of other children who were likely still afraid to speak. What do you need me to do? Princess Anne walked to her desk and pulled out a draft statement. I am going to hold a press conference this afternoon. I am going to take full responsibility for the systemic failures that allowed Lord Pemberton to access children through events and organizations we supported. I am going to commit to comprehensive reforms and independent oversight of all our youth programs. And I am going to encourage any additional victims to come forward. Morrison read through the draft statement. It was unlike anything he had ever seen from a member of the royal family. Instead of carefully crafted language designed to minimize responsibility and exposure, Princess Anne had written a direct acknowledgement of institutional failure and a commitment to comprehensive accountability. Your Royal Highness, this statement will create enormous controversy. Your family will be furious. The government will be concerned about constitutional implications. The media will see it as admission of guilt. Yes, Princess Anne agreed. But, James, do you know what will create even more controversy? The revelation that we knew children were being harmed and chose to protect our reputation instead of protecting them. Morrison realized that Princess Anne was right. The investigation would eventually reveal the scope of the royal family's association with Lord Pemberton. When that happened, their response would be judged not just by what they said, but by how quickly they had said it and how much they had tried to hide. "What do you need me to do?" Morrison asked. "I need you to help me bypass the palace communications office and speak directly to the press. They will try to stop me from making this statement, but I cannot let institutional self-interest override moral responsibility." Morrison looked at the woman who had spent her entire life serving the crown and following protocol, now asking him to help her break both tradition and chain of command in order to protect children she had never met. "I will help you," Morrison said simply. As they began planning Princess Anne's unprecedented press conference, Morrison realized that they were not just responding to a crisis. They were attempting to transform how powerful institutions handled their responsibility to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Whether they would succeed remained to be seen. But Morrison knew that they were finally doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. The press conference was scheduled for 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. By 3:30, Princess Anne had still not received permission from the Queen or the Palace Communications Office to proceed. In fact, she had been explicitly ordered not to make any public statements until a coordinated response could be developed with input from the government, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and constitutional experts. Morrison found himself in the extraordinary position of helping a member of the royal family directly disobey orders from the crown. He had arranged for a small conference room at a hotel near the palace to be used as the venue, understanding that holding the press conference at Buckingham Palace itself would be impossible without official approval. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said as they prepared to leave the palace, "once we walk out those gates, there will be no turning back. Are you certain about this decision?" Princess Anne looked at him with more determination than Morrison had seen from her throughout this entire ordeal. "James, I have spent my entire life following orders, maintaining protocol, and putting institutional interests above personal conscience. Yesterday, I looked at photographs of children who were harmed while I was following those same orders and maintaining that same protocol. I will not make that mistake again." They slipped out through a service entrance that Morrison had used for security purposes over the years. Even so, they were recognized within minutes, and, by the time they reached the hotel, a dozen reporters were following them. The conference room Morrison had arranged was small and simple, nothing like the grand staterooms where royal announcements were typically made. Princess Anne sat at a plain wooden table with a simple microphone, looking more like a concerned citizen than a member of the royal family. The room filled quickly with journalists, many of whom seemed puzzled by the informal setting and the absence of official palace staff. Morrison stood at the back of the room, watching for security threats while simultaneously serving as Princess Anne's only support in what was likely the most important moment of her life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Princess Anne began, speaking directly into the microphone without notes or prepared remarks, "I have called this press conference to address the arrest of Lord Edmund Pemberton and to discuss the royal family's response to the serious allegations against him." The room fell silent. Morrison could see reporters exchanging glances, recognizing that this was not going to be a typical royal statement filled with carefully neutral language. "Let me begin with the most important point," Princess Anne continued. "If the allegations against Lord Pemberton are proven true, then children have been sexually abused by someone who had access to them through events and organizations that my family supported and promoted. Those children were betrayed not only by their abuser, but by the institutions and systems that were supposed to protect them." Morrison watched as journalists began typing frantically, understanding that Princess Anne was making statements that went far beyond anything the royal family had ever said about institutional responsibility. "Lord Pemberton was not merely an acquaintance of our family," Princess Anne said. "Over a period of 15 years, he attended 67 events where children were present, including 23 events at royal residences or with official royal patronage. He was photographed with members of my family on numerous occasions. We actively supported his charity work and encouraged others to trust him based on that support." A reporter raised her hand. "Your Royal Highness, are you saying that the royal family bears responsibility for Lord Pemberton's alleged crimes?" Princess Anne paused for a moment before answering. "I am saying that we bear responsibility for the systems that gave him access to children. We bear responsibility for failing to implement adequate safeguarding procedures.
And, we bear responsibility for creating an environment where parents felt honored to have their children spend time with someone simply because he had royal approval. Morrison realized that Princess Anne was doing something unprecedented in the history of the British monarchy. She was accepting institutional responsibility for systemic failures that had enabled harm to children.
Your Royal Highness, another reporter called out, what is the Queen's position on these matters?
I am not speaking for the Queen, Princess Anne replied. I am speaking as someone who has spent 40 years attending events where children were present, often in the company of Lord Pemberton. I am speaking as someone who personally encouraged parents to trust their children with organizations that failed to protect those children. Morrison's phone began buzzing with calls that he ignored. He assumed they were from palace officials who had learned about the press conference and were trying to stop it. But Princess Anne continued speaking, and Morrison continued to let his phone ring. I want to make several commitments to the British people, Princess Anne said. First, I am calling for an independent investigation into all safeguarding procedures at royal events and charity functions. This investigation will have full access to all records, all staff members, and all family members who may have relevant information.
Morrison could hardly believe what he was hearing.
Princess Anne was voluntarily subjecting the royal family to the kind of comprehensive external scrutiny that they had spent centuries avoiding. Second, Princess Anne continued, I am establishing an independent oversight board that will be responsible for approving all future royal involvement with youth organizations. This board will include child protection experts, law enforcement representatives, and survivors of child abuse. No one will have access to children through royal events or patronage without their explicit approval. A reporter in the front row raised his hand.
Your Royal Highness, what about other members of the royal family who also supported Lord Pemberton's work? Will they be making similar statements?
Princess Anne's expression tightened slightly. I cannot speak for other members of my family. I can only speak for my own actions and my own commitment to ensuring that the mistakes that enabled harm to children are never repeated. Morrison understood that Princess Anne was essentially isolating herself from the rest of the royal family. By making these commitments without consultation or approval, she was forcing them to either support her position or publicly disagree with her approach to protecting children. Third, Princess Anne said, I want to speak directly to any child or adult who may have been harmed by Lord Pemberton or anyone else who gained access to children through royal events or patronage.
I am sorry.
I am sorry that systems I helped maintain failed to protect you.
I am sorry that trust placed in our institutions was betrayed.
And I am sorry that it has taken allegations against someone so closely associated with our family to force us to confront these failures. Morrison felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Princess Anne's words. In his years of protecting the royal family, he had heard many carefully crafted apologies designed to minimize legal exposure while expressing appropriate regret. This was something entirely different. This was a human being accepting moral responsibility for institutional failures and personally apologizing to children who had been harmed.
Your Royal Highness, a reporter asked, what consequences do you think there should be for family members or institutions that failed to protect children?
Princess Anne looked directly into the camera. I believe that anyone who had the power to protect children and failed to do so should face appropriate consequences, regardless of their position or status.
That includes members of my family, including myself. Morrison realized that Princess Anne had just opened herself and the entire royal family to potential criminal liability.
By acknowledging institutional failure and accepting responsibility, she was providing grounds for prosecutors to argue that people in positions of authority should have known about the abuse and acted to prevent it. Finally, Princess Anne said, I want to announce that I am establishing the Children's Protection Foundation with an initial endowment of £5 million from my personal funds. This foundation will provide support services for children who have been abused by people in positions of authority, and will advocate for stronger safeguarding measures in all institutions that work with children. Morrison's phone had stopped ringing, but he noticed that several reporters were receiving messages that seemed to be causing considerable excitement. He suspected that palace officials were issuing contradictory statements or attempting damage control. Your Royal Highness, a reporter called out, we are receiving reports that Buckingham Palace is issuing a statement saying that your comments do not represent the official position of the royal family.
How do you respond?
Princess Anne smiled sadly. The official position of the royal family will be determined by how we respond to this crisis in the coming weeks and months. My position is that protecting children from harm must take priority over protecting institutions from embarrassment. As the press conference concluded, Morrison helped Princess Anne navigate through the crowd of reporters and photographers. Questions were shouted at them from all directions, but Princess Anne did not respond beyond thanking the journalists for their attention. In the car driving back to the palace, they sat in silence for several minutes before Princess Anne spoke. James, by tomorrow morning I will likely be stripped of my royal duties and asked to step back from public life.
Are you prepared for the consequences of supporting me in this?
Morrison thought about his daughter, about the 12 children whose testimonies had started this investigation, about all the children who might be safer because Princess Anne had chosen to tell the truth rather than protect institutional reputation. Your Royal Highness, I became a royal protection officer because I wanted to serve something larger than myself. Today, for the first time in my career, I feel like we actually have served something larger than ourselves.
Princess Anne nodded. Even if we are both unemployed tomorrow?
Even then, Morrison replied. When they returned to Buckingham Palace, they found that security had been increased significantly.
Morrison's supervisor was waiting for them at the entrance with a grim expression. Sergeant Morrison, you are relieved of duty pending an investigation into your conduct.
Please surrender your security credentials and weapon. Morrison had expected this, but it still felt surreal to hand over the tools of a profession that had defined his adult life.
What about Princess Anne? Morrison asked. Her Royal Highness has been asked to meet with the Queen immediately. Princess Anne looked at Morrison one last time. Thank you, James. For everything.
As Morrison walked away from Buckingham Palace for what he assumed would be the last time, he felt something he had not expected: relief. For years, he had protected people and institutions without questioning whether they deserved protection. Today, he had finally protected something that unquestionably deserved it: the truth. 6 months later, Lord Pemberton was convicted on 28 counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to life in prison. The independent investigation that Princess Anne had called for revealed systematic failures in safeguarding procedures across multiple royal-affiliated organizations. Significant reforms were implemented, and several high-ranking officials resigned. Princess Anne was quietly restored to her royal duties after the Queen concluded that her unprecedented honesty had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's moral authority. Morrison was offered his job back, but he declined, choosing instead to work with the Children's Protection Foundation that Princess Anne had established. The manila folder that had started everything was preserved as evidence in the criminal trial. But, more importantly, it had become the catalyst for changes that would protect countless children in the future. Morrison often thought about that rainy Tuesday morning when he first noticed Princess Anne shaking. He realized now that what he had witnessed was not just fear, but the moment when someone in a position of extraordinary power chose to use that power for something more important than protecting herself. Sometimes the most important moments in history begin with someone who was supposed to be strong allowing themselves to be vulnerable. Sometimes protecting the truth requires abandoning the safety of lies. And, sometimes, the people who are supposed to be perfect serve the world best by admitting their failures and working to ensure they never happen again. The weight of truth, Morrison had learned, was indeed sometimes unbearable. But it was still lighter than the weight of silence.